What is up, Sleep Tribe? Welcome to a brand new episode of the Healthy Sleep Revolution podcast. I am your host, Dr. Meghna Dassani, but enough about me. Today, I have on somebody super special. I think we connected, what was it, 2-3 years ago, maybe?
Yeah.
And I have followed her journey, and it's an amazing one. And I wanted to bring you guys along and be a part of it. So before I go on down my rambling rabbit holes about her, we have with us today Emma Cooksey, who, if you guys aren't following her on Instagram, go do that. Sleep Apnea Stories is her handle, and she has a fabulous story. But let me say hi to her first. How are you?
Hi, I'm really good. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, so exciting. I know you're super crazy busy. You've been traveling all over the place. You're speaking and you're doing such amazing things with Project Sleep. I want to touch upon that as well. But so thank you. Thank you for taking the time to jump on.
My pleasure.
How are things?
Things are really well. Like you mentioned, I have my own podcast, Sleep Apnea Stories. So
I'm a huge fan.
Well, thank you. I'm coming up on 100 episodes soon. So it's kind of crazy. I didn't really know when I started it where it would go, and I'm still here. I am 2.5 years later, still chugging along. So yeah, I'm actually between my seasons right now, but I'm coming back with some new episodes in 2 weeks. So I'm excited.
I am excited for you. We'll have to celebrate that in a big way for sure. So for our listeners that don't know, Emma is one that actually lived with undiagnosed sleep apnea, and she lived through suffering consequences until she decided to take matters in her own hand and be her own advocate. And it's been a journey. I'm going to let her share. So go ahead, Emma, and just tell us, how did you get into this? I've heard it before, and just share away.
So
tell us everything.
I don't want to repeat myself from last time when I was on, because maybe some people listen to that, but we'll do it briefly.
Okay.
So essentially, I think I first noticed there was something really wrong with my sleep in my early 20s. So I found that I was just like, when people talk about excessive daytime sleepiness, I was struggling to hold down a full-time job because I just really couldn't keep my eyes open in the afternoon. So I went to the doctor, and I think that it's very common among women with these symptoms of obstructive sleep apnea, where they go to the doctor and they say, I'm so exhausted. I'm waking up even more tired than the night before when I went to sleep. I had morning headaches. I had all the things, textbook, right? But I think because of a lot of the things we've talked about before, the medical community isn't really looking for sleep apnea in young women. And so I was told, sleep disorders are really rare, and sleep apnea really only happens in older, overweight men, which we know is not correct. And so essentially I was sent away. And at that time, I think that it didn't occur to me to advocate for myself or to seek a second opinion, because I came from, my family was very whatever the doctor says must be what's going on. So I almost trusted that above my own intuition. So all through my 20s, I did go to the doctor a number of times, but every time I was told, well, it's not going to be something to do with your sleep. Try and sleep more is kind of what I was told. And, and for anybody that's dealing with sleep apnea, that's not it. I certainly was sleeping 8 and 9 hours.
I wish it were as easy as that.
Yeah. So I just kind of when I have this presentation I just gave at the Philadelphia Sleep Conference, and there's a slide where on one side of the slide I have me and my husband getting married. So I think for a lot of people outwardly, my 20s were going just fine. I had a good job. I was, going out with friends, going on trips, love my husband. It was all great. But then on the other side of the slide, I had a picture of me fast asleep with my mouth open on the back of a dive boat. We took a trip to Egypt, and there's amazing diving in the Sinai Peninsula, but the whole time other people were diving, I was just there napping because I just couldn't keep my eyes open. So it definitely was like this kind of dual life where I was getting on with things, but I definitely was struggling, you know. And then, so my husband's originally from America. So we were married in Scotland, but we moved to Northeast Florida. And soon after we got here, I got pregnant with my first child. And and carried on going to the doctor and saying, now that I'm pregnant, I'm really exhausted. There's really something wrong with my sleep. And was told, you know, well, you're pregnant though, so being tired is normal in pregnancy. So the problem with that, like, and that makes me really angry now, because the more people I've interviewed on my podcast, the more they're pointing out that the prevalence of obstructive sleep apnea actually goes up during pregnancy and menopause. And these are times when women are told, oh, you're tired because you're pregnant, or you're tired because you're in menopause, without, you know, actually looking into, well, could they have obstructive sleep apnea? So having been sent away, like I had my first child, and I actually, after I had her, I think I felt as though, you know, almost like I had stuff in common with people, because everybody else was tired because of all the disrupted sleep, when actually I just kind of felt the same as I always felt.
Right.
But, you know, at least I felt like I kind of had people to talk to. And so then soon after she was born, she was still a baby, and I fell asleep at the wheel. And that was the final straw for me, where I think that, you know, up to that point, I kind of, even though I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere with the doctors I was going to, I still had that feeling of, well, you know, kind of politeness, and feeling like, even though I really felt at that point there was something wrong, I think falling asleep at the wheel was like a definite line in the sand, where I was like, I've got to sort this out, because I felt like, you know, I almost died. So at that point, that was how I managed to get my diagnosis, because finally the doctor's office was like, oh, well, if you fell asleep at the wheel, maybe there is something wrong with your sleep, right?
That can't be
So,
good.
yeah.
Goodness.
And so that was at the age of 30. So then, you know, I think, so it's in 2008. So I think it's worth saying that, because I feel like things have started changing a little bit. But at that point, there certainly was no discussion of why I had sleep apnea in the first place. And, you know, it was immediately like, CPAP is the treatment option, and nothing else was mentioned. And so I started CPAP, and I struggled. It's really a tough therapy to get used to, especially when you don't have support. And so over time, I kind of figured it out, and I kind of went about my business for like 10 years, and had another baby, and was juggling, you know, 2 kids and a part-time job and all of that. But I always just kind of felt isolated and alone in that journey. I didn't know anybody else with sleep apnea. And I just always felt like every so often, if I would hear about it, it would be somebody's like uncle had a CPAP machine, or, you know, like I didn't really know any other moms in the same situation. So I think that was kind of the impetus for starting my podcast. I just felt like there must be other people out there like me. And also I just started hearing, you know, reading a little bit more online, as, you know, like it became like more like, you know, 2020 rather than 2008. You know, there just came to be more information available, where I was starting to see information on other treatment options like oral appliances and Inspire implants and different things. And I thought, well, you know, if I don't know about these things, there must be other people out there who don't know, who would like to hear about them. So that was really kind of the impetus for starting the podcast.
Yeah, that's amazing, and such great work. I'm so grateful and thankful that you took that on. So I want to jump into, like you talked about alternate treatments and such. I know you, from everything I see and read, you know, you use your CPAP and you've gotten to the point where you've figured it out. But you've tried other therapy as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind going a little bit into that, just so people have perspective from a non-medical perspective, from someone that's been there, done that?
Right. So, well, where do we start? So on my podcast early on, I interviewed Dr. Natasha Hassam Sarwar, and she was talking all about oral appliances, which I was like, well, that's really interesting because I just didn't know a lot about them. So she said that whenever she saw patients in her practice who were doing oral appliances, she always worked with them to shift from mouth breathing to nasal breathing.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, why do you do that? Right? This was a completely brand new concept to me. And she said, and this was probably right after I started, maybe in 2020 in that fall or something. And she said, well, you've read James Nestor's book, Breath, right? And I said, no, I think somebody has sent it to me, but I'd never read it. So that weekend, I read that book cover to cover, and it just explained everything that had been going on with me, right? So for people that haven't read it, like there's just so much information in there about mouth breathing as a child, I had everything stacked against me. I had huge tonsils that were never taken out. I had allergies. I had a really high narrow arch palate. I had a really big tongue tie. I was a really serious mouth breather, thumb sucker, just all the things I mentioned in that book as being things that can detrimentally impact your airway. So that really kind of set me on a almost like down a rabbit hole at that point, right? So I'm kind of thinking to myself, well, what can I do? And I'm like a woman at that point in my early 40s who's been mouth breathing, my whole life. Right. So I'm a little bit like, how hard can it be? So I learned about, Buteyko breathing and myofunctional therapy and palate expansion. And so I was still using my CPAP every night, but it's worth saying some people are on CPAP and their quality of life is completely transformed and they feel so much better and they love their CPAP and all that. That was never really me. So I got to the point where I used my CPAP religiously every night. I definitely felt like I got more oxygen to my brain and I wasn't falling asleep at the wheel so intensely like I had been before, right? So it definitely helped me, but I didn't wake up energized. I didn't have what I would consider like a good night's sleep. So I still definitely felt like I'm living with a sleep disorder. Like it's not, fixed kind of thing. And it really appealed to me to try and get to like some of the root causes of what was going on with me. So I started out with, I'd interviewed Patrick McKeown. Mm-hmm. And if you listen to that episode, it's quite funny because he talks about this thing, the control pause, which if people listening aren't familiar, that's to do with how long, like you breathe in and breathe out, and then you hold your breath and see how long it takes to have the urge to breathe. So when I interviewed Patrick McKeown, my control pause was 4 seconds, not 14, not 40, 4. And I don't know if it's the lowest control pause he's ever heard of, but he just was like shocked. And he said, oh dear, like, yeah, oh dear, that's really low. So soon after that interview, I set about working with Jo Brierley, who is a functional breathing coach who lives in England. She trained with Patrick and with a number of other really great breathwork people. So her thing is to really get you back to completely nasal breathing and doing a bunch of different exercises to kind of increase your tolerance to CO2. So I did that for 6 weeks and my control pause went from 4 to 24. So it's difficult to explain if any of you listening doesn't have sleep apnea, but the difference between that, like it's not that suddenly my sleep apnea went away, but I think that the quality of my life improved because I wasn't so like, gasping for air all the time. Right. And it kind of like stopped me from that whole like over breathing through my mouth all the time. And so it definitely did. And I think that people underestimate how anxious you can feel if your tongue's not resting in the right place and you're not breathing through your nose. It really, you're kind of fight or flight all the time. So I think that whole experience really helped with my day-to-day how I felt. But I didn't really expect it to have some huge impact on my sleep apnea, but it definitely, helped my life. So then the next thing was because I got really interested in myofunctional therapy, partly from James Nestor's book, but also I'd started interviewing some people on the podcast about it. And so there aren't nearly enough studies on myofunctional therapy, but the ones that they've done have shown, a significant reduction in AHI for people. So I literally Googled myofunctional therapy, Jacksonville, Florida. And I found Caitlin Schrum, who is wonderful, who's here. And to begin with, I was kind of like, I write articles sometimes, and I was kind of thinking, even if I don't end up doing it, it would make a really good blog post or an article. Mm-hmm. So I just kind of went with a kind of curiosity, but not really sure what this would be like. And when I went for my intake, I think Caitlin was extremely professional, but there was some things where we realized just how dysfunctional everything about how I was breathing, speaking, eating, swallowing were, right? So again, as a consequence of all the different things that happened to me as a child, I really didn't develop proper tongue posture and all of that. So at one point she asked me to eat a granola bar, and I was like, okay. And I broke this big giant granola bar in half, shoved half of it in my mouth, kind of chomped on it a little bit, kind of swallowed it, and then had a bunch of water to get rid of the rest of it, right? Which is not what you're supposed to do. So right. She looked a little bit horrified, and she was like, wow, is that how you're eating? And I was like, yep. And at that point, she took a lot of measurements, and she was saying that my tongue tie was really significant and having a big impact in keeping my
that was going to be my
low.
Question. Was your tongue tie addressed? Was that part of it?
So then we did myofunctional therapy together probably for about 3 months, I think, and it got to the point where I built a lot of strength and tone in my tongue, but this tongue tie was really stopping me from fully, you're supposed to be able to touch, not just the tip of your tongue to the roof of your mouth. You're supposed to be able to have the whole of your tongue up there. And the back of my tongue was just not having it because of this tongue tie. So we worked together. I think that I had a lot of the same issue that so many people for themselves and their children find, where it was pretty tough to find a provider who knew what we were talking about, Yeah. So certainly there's a lot of people who will, snip your tongue tie, but you need somebody who is going to look at the function of your tongue and make sure that when they do the tongue tie release, your tongue's able to do all the, things that they want it to do. So we found a really wonderful pediatric dentist called Dr. Myers. And I went there and had my tongue tie released. And I'd read a lot about it, and I almost felt like people were being kind of melodramatic and saying it was totally amazing and all this tension was released. And I was just kind of thinking, yes. Really? But then, so for me, after the tongue tie was done, Dr. Meyer said to me, how does it feel? How does your neck and your face feel? And I was kind of touching my face, and I said, I don't think I'll know until all of the anesthetic wears off, because it just feels warm. And he was like, well, there's really no anesthetic anywhere but your tongue, so I'm not sure if that's what you're feeling. So then I was driving home, and it kind of dawned on me that all of this facial tension and pain that had been really normal for me was gone. So it definitely had a huge impact in terms of I feel like that pulling again, having a tongue tie just makes everything off, so that you're kind of pulling and putting weird strains on your face and your neck that you don't even realize. So that happened. And then of course we realized that now that this tongue tie was released, I didn't have enough room in my palate.
Yes.
So do you want to get into all of that?
Yeah, let's do it. Because Here's the thing. Our listeners are mainly parents. They're everyday folks who it's amazing that they're getting your perspective, because, when I talk about it in dental terms, it's different as opposed to.
I can't tell you how much, every time I find a parent who is saying my child snores or my child sleeps with an open mouth, I just am like alarm bells, and I'm just like, you need to please go and take your child to see somebody, because I so wish that had happened for me, right? So anyway, I've been to, just because of my strange job being a sleep apnea podcaster, I'd been to a lot of different conferences, and I noticed that, so I'd learned all about the different options for palate expansion, and I read all about surgically assisted rapid palate expansion, so SARP and MSE and all these different things. And it was right around the time when people were starting to talk about, well, James Nestor had been talking about using, oh, it's just gone out of my head. What's it called? It'll come to me and I'll be like, oh yeah. So anyway, he was talking about using a removable expansion appliance. And so originally what I did was I just was really interested to learn more about that, because all of the dentists I talked to, probably you included, were like, your palatal suture that holds together like the roof of your mouth is fused in adults, right? So they kind of said like, this whole idea of having a removable expandable appliance is not gonna actually change your suture, right? Which is what they were kind of saying about the removable appliance. So I heard all that, and it's not that I didn't, like, I just think that I wanted something, like, I didn't fancy the idea of surgically assisted rapid palate expansion. It just didn't look very fun to me. And I talked to a couple of people who had used Vivos appliances, which are removable palate expanders that they market to help with sleep apnea. So those people, so there's one woman in particular, and this is how much I don't believe anything I read online. There's one woman in particular, Chandra Hartman, who I found her online, and she had been saying like that this had helped her. So I contacted her and said, would you be okay to talk on the phone? So I talked with her, and then I actually interviewed her on the podcast, and she's in Florida too. So me and my family were having a vacation in the Panhandle, and that's where she lived, and I actually met up with her. So I felt at that point like it worked for this one patient that I knew. And so even though a lot of people were telling me this is super controversial, there's not enough research, like, you're desperate for a good night's sleep, and I just thought,
whatever we can do, if it helps me feel better, I'm willing to try it.
So anyway, and then it turned out that a dentist I already knew was offering this, and so I thought, okay, so I sign up, and I did. So to kind of explain to people, they're essentially like, I think most people have the experience, if you had braces as a teenager, it's kind of like the expanders that they use before those braces with sort of other wiggly wires on it. But it's basically like, that's the idea, like you're turning it yourself to make more space, but just very gradually.
There's a screw in the middle, and you're actually trying to expand it.
So, but it's like tiny movements over a long period of time. So you have to wear it like 15 to 16 hours every 24 hours. So I did that for 15 months. Okay. And so a lot of things went wrong. So the first thing was, so they tell you at the outset, like, there's not one thing, like sleep apnea is like multifactorial, right? So there's different things going on for different people. And they did tell me at the outset, like, ideally you need to lose weight. You need to, figure out what's going on with your nose, because my nasal inflammation and stuff was not great either. But I think part of me just felt like, yeah, but I'm doing the palate expansion. So, but there really is no one thing. Like, you kind of have to address all the systemic things,
right?
Which I learned the hard way. So there was partly that. And so I started perimenopause in a big way and gained some weight, like not really changing anything about my life, but that happened. So that definitely didn't help. I think there's this thing where, because it's quite a new product, a lot of the dentists, like, it's their first couple of patients, like they aren't, it takes a while to really figure it all out. So every time I went, they weren't like measuring to check that like the tiny expansions were adding up to the correct amount. And what I've realized in the process is sometimes these appliances will wind themselves back. So you'll be doing all of the turning, but over the night, basically like the pressure of your palate is basically winding back the mechanism. So that happened a lot to me. So when we came out the other end, we did a sleep study, and it showed that my sleep apnea was actually worse. And so that was the point that I kind of abandoned. So I think like for me, it didn't work, but I don't think, I mean, there certainly are cases of people where it has worked, but I think I would just tell people, do all the research you can possibly do, like look at all of the different options and the outcomes, and
ask the question.
Ask the questions. Yeah. And definitely I think like you know, there becomes this thing. I think if anybody's trying to simplify sleep apnea, it's not simple, right? There are going to be some people where, you know, it's more straightforward, but for most people, especially when you've been mouth breathing for 40 years and you're trying to turn that around, like that's a big undertaking. So just really, if people are, a lot of what the dentists are telling people is like, do you want to breathe through a cocktail straw or a garden hose? But to me, that's like way oversimplifying it, because like my airway, like if you looked at a CT scan, did get bigger over this period. Like you can see an increase in improvement, but my sleep apnea got worse. So it's, you know, it's not necessarily that one thing, you know, will completely fix it. So that was that.
And that's what I tell patients, you know, we're dealing with live human beings. Yes. Everything is different. Things change over time. You know, like you said, perimenopause played its role. So many moving parts and pieces. Got to address nasal breathing, got to address allergies, got to address inflammation. So we got to make sure all of that ties in together.
And I think also there's the whole thing of the soft tissue part of it, right? Which I think people forget. Like you're not talking about static, like just bone, you're talking about like squishy moving soft tissue. So
that is the word, squishy, floppy. That's what I say. It's floppy.
So it's kind of a lot. So now I'm at the point, I kind of you know, took a few months. I was really sad, obviously, that I'd spent a bunch of money, it didn't work and all of that. But then I think once I kind of came through that period, I decided it was good to talk about it, because I think like there's so many people looking into these options, like, you know, to know other people's experience can be helpful.
Knowledge is power, for sure. Knowledge is power that allows you to make decisions. Yeah.
And so now I'm on the hard road of actually trying to, you know, figure out my nose and my inflammation and lose some weight and all those things. So yeah.
Wow. It's been quite a ride. It has.
Yeah, seriously.
I wanted to talk to you about something that I know you're super passionate about. And I am so glad you are working with Project Sleep. I know you're on the board of directors with them, which is amazing. And you do some great work with them. Tell us how you got involved. Tell us about Project Sleep.
Yeah, so thanks for asking. So originally I had read, there's a wonderful memoir by a woman called Julie Flygar, and it's called Wide Awake and Dreaming, and it's a memoir all about her experience of living with narcolepsy and cataplexy. And I really didn't know anything about narcolepsy. And when I read that book, it just felt so relatable to me, and like we had so many things in common, and I knew I wanted to interview her on the podcast. So I had her on my podcast, and we talked, and I knew that she was the founder and CEO of this nonprofit Project Sleep. So I kind of had been following her on social media, and I loved what they were doing, and we talked a lot. And not to say anything bad about any of the sleep apnea nonprofits, but I felt like Julie really got what I was saying when I said I definitely didn't want to start my own nonprofit, because it seemed like a lot of work, and I wanted to be really active and do some things to really move the needle and change public perceptions about who has sleep disorders, and just really change. I mean, like some of the statistics are, you know, 80% of people with sleep apnea are undiagnosed. But for women, that's 90%. And for Black Americans, it's 95%. And so what Project Sleep were doing seemed very hands-on and about really empowering patients to use their voice. So I started off just by getting involved, like by sharing a bunch of stuff on social media and just like knowing what they were doing. But then I went ahead and signed up for their Rising Voices program. So every summer they have this wonderful program where anybody living with a sleep disorder, but also family members of people with sleep disorders, can sign up for this 6-week-long program you do over Zoom just from home, and it teaches you really to tell your story using like a 25-minute presentation that you can give in all sorts of settings when you're done. So the idea is to have people in their own communities speaking in classrooms and medical settings, because so many doctors are just not taught anything about sleep disorders. So the idea of it is really that you draw people in so much more by sharing your own experience and your own story. And obviously, because I have a podcast called Sleep Apnea Stories, where I encourage people, share their story, that's my thing, it's my jam. So once I'd completed that, we talked more and more, and I just really expressed interest in getting more involved, and the opportunity to join the board came up, and I just knew it was the right thing, So it's been really wonderful. It's been a lot of work, but there's a lot of different areas that they're pushing things forward, and one of those is through like actually going to Washington. So I was able to go with them to Washington, D.C. in October and speak to legislators about my story and why I care so much about getting more funding for sleep disorders research. So that really was, I think a lot of people get very jaded and fed up with Washington and think it all takes too long to do things. And it does. But I feel like having actually been there and seeing how it works, we just had every year Julie puts together what's called a sleep letter, like where they have all sorts of representatives in the House sign on. And it really helped me to see that really it doesn't take that many people. Like we had, like more than 30 representatives sign on, and that's purely from patient advocates in our, like in Project Sleep and people that follow us, just calling that office and saying, please sign this letter, I really care about it. So the wording in that, not to get too in the weeds, but the wording in that is exciting because it's the first time we're really asking for the CDC to take action and put some budget behind actually raising awareness about sleep disorders, which is what we really need. So that's really awesome. And then, there's just so many areas where they have a really great program called Narcolepsy Nerd Alert. And I saw a lot of opportunity to, what they do is they do a webinar. So they have a video and then it becomes a PDF and then now a podcast. And so it's just a lot of topics that are really helpful. They have experts come and talk about narcolepsy. So now we're looking at how do we take that and expand to different sleep disorders. And it's just exciting.
It is. It is still so new. And I am so glad that there's people like you, Project Sleep, that are actually doing something with it. So thank you for that. The last time we spoke, you mentioned something about a book.
Oh my gosh.
Was I not supposed to ask?
So here's the thing about the book. So I do have a draft done of the book, but now I'm thinking the book's going to slightly change, because when I first set out, I thought I was going to just figure out my sleep apnea. And so I thought that my book would end with me not having sleep apnea anymore. And that's not quite what happened, as we just talked about. So I'm still working on it, but I think that I'm the mother of 2 girls, and one plays softball and one plays volleyball. And, and I'm doing the podcast and all the stuff. So I think that this summer I've kind of blocked out some time. So I'm hoping eventually this thing will be finished.
So it's coming. Yes, we're going to follow you for updates, and it's exciting. That's amazing. I cannot wait. As we wind up today's episode, what are your top 3 tips for anybody listening to us today?
Oh gosh. So, I've got a lot of tips. So people Well, the first thing we talked about a bunch, but people with children, you've got to watch your kids sleeping and check that they're sleeping with their mouth closed, breathing silently through their nose. And that's what should be happening. If anything else is happening, please, 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 like take them to a provider who knows something about airway and like all that we talked about, myofunctional therapy and breath work and all that kind of stuff, because I feel like if those things had been available to me as a child, I wouldn't be in the situation I'm in right now with my sleep apnea. So that's probably the first thing. The second thing is, one of the reasons I started my podcast was to really shatter stereotypes about who has sleep apnea. So for a bunch of different reasons, the medical community has been really focused on AHI, like the number of times people stop breathing an hour, as being the main thing they're looking for. And so it's just that like stop bang and a lot of the different screeners they use, it tends to be much easier for an older overweight man to get a diagnosis, right? So what I would say, is definitely be prepared to advocate for yourself. I wish I'd advocated for myself more in the beginning. If you're excessively sleepy during the day, that's not normal and you have to do something about it. So even if you're going to a primary care physician or a GP and they're saying you don't really fit the criteria, I don't think that I would send you for a sleep study. Know now that there's so many other options, right? Lots of dentists will have home sleep tests right there. There's lots of, online options for home sleep testing. So it doesn't have to be this thing where you just say, okay, I'm just not going to bother. If you think there's something wrong, and especially if you think there's something wrong with your kid, just keep pushing until you find answers. And I mean, this is probably similar to the first one, but like mouth breathing is not normal.
Absolutely. I cannot
anyone,
say that loudly enough.
kids or adults. Like mouth breathing is not normal. You just it's an indicator you should do something. And I really feel like everybody should go to a myofunctional therapist and figure out what's going on with them.
Yes.
So,
I say this in dentistry too. We should be evaluating the swallow. When you were telling us about, you eating that granola bar, I was like, yes, that should be part of your regular dental exam.
yes.
It's like, what does your swallow look like? So absolutely. I agree with you 100% right there.
Yay.
Yes, perfect. Well, thank you so much
Thank you for having me.
Yes. How can people learn more about you, what you do, Project Sleep? How can they stalk you, for lack of a better word?
So a great place to start would be my website, which is sleepapneastories.com. And it has a whole page on like how to work with me, like where to follow me, all of that. So on Instagram, that's really the place that I'm the most available, and I spend a lot of time in my DMs there. So it's at Sleep Apnea Stories. And then for Project Sleep, you can go to the website, which is project-sleep.com. And then they're on Instagram, they're on Facebook, all those good things. And so there it's project_sleep for Instagram. And you'll learn everything they have going on. And like really, I mean, getting involved is as much or as little as you want to do. I mean, I think people don't realize how much of a big impact they can have just by seeing that we want people to contact their representative, and they literally can send 2 emails and have, had a huge impact on the future of like funding, raising awareness about sleep disorders. So yeah, there's plenty of ways to get involved. And, people are always astonished when I email them back, but like, you can just go to my website and email me if you want to chat to me.
You are super responsive. Yes, I will attest to that. And not because I've known her forever, but super, super sweet human being right here. So thank you so much for your time today. I know you're exhausted. Go take a nap. We both talked about it earlier.
I will.
And for those listening in, I will have all of her contact information, her Instagram handle, website, her bio, how to get a hold of her, how to work with her in our show notes. So make sure you go grab that. And as always, share our episode. This one has some valuable information for loved ones that may be sleepy and don't know why. So we need all this information in our corner. Leave us a review, share this episode, and I will see everybody next time.